Welcome back to A Cup of History. Last time, we talked about the Reign of Terror and the fall of Robespierre, but today I'm really curious about what happened next. You mentioned Napoleon. How did he rise to power after all this chaos?
Great question, Chris. After Robespierre's fall in 1794, France was still in turmoil. The Reign of Terror was over, but the country was politically unstable, and there was still a lot of tension between different factions.
Exactly. In 1795, a new government was established, called the Directory. It was a more moderate regime compared to the radical Jacobins, but it wasn't very popular. The Directory struggled with corruption, economic problems, and threats from both royalists and radicals.
So, things were still pretty unstable?
Yes. The Directory was constantly dealing with crises, and many people in France were unhappy with it. This created an opportunity for someone like Napoleon Bonaparte to rise to power.
Napoleon was a brilliant military leader, and by the late 1790s, he had already gained a reputation for his success on the battlefield. He led successful campaigns in Italy and Egypt, which made him a national hero.
So he was already famous before he took control of the government?
Exactly. Napoleon's military victories gave him a lot of influence, and by 1799, the Directory was on the verge of collapse. In November of that year, Napoleon staged a coup d'état, known as the Coup of 18 Brumaire, and took control of the French government.
With that coup, the Directory was dissolved, and a new government called the Consulate was established, with Napoleon as its leader. He became the first consul, which essentially gave him dictatorial powers.
So he didn't waste any time taking control.
Not at all. Napoleon was incredibly ambitious, and once he was in power, he set about consolidating his control over France. He worked to stabilize the country by reforming the government, improving the economy, and creating a more centralized administration.
Napoleon also established the Napoleonic Code, which was a comprehensive set of laws that reformed the legal system in France. It emphasized principles like equality before the law, religious tolerance, and merit-based government positions.
I've heard of the Napoleonic Code. That sounds like a big deal.
It was. The Napoleonic Code became the foundation for modern legal systems in many countries, and its influence is still felt today. Napoleon's reforms helped bring stability to France after years of chaos during the Revolution.
So he really turned things around for France, didn't he?
In many ways, yes, but Napoleon's ambitions didn't stop with just reforming France. He wanted to expand his power across Europe, which led to a series of wars known as the Napoleonic Wars.
Over the next decade, Napoleon built an empire that spanned much of Europe. He was crowned Emperor of the French in 1804, marking the end of the French Republic and the beginning of the French Empire.
Wait, so after all that fighting to get rid of a king, France ended up with an emperor?
It's one of the ironies of the Revolution. The Revolution had been about liberty, equality, and fraternity. But by the time Napoleon took control, France had essentially traded one form of absolute rule for another.
Napoleon was a complex figure. He saw himself as continuing the legacy of the Revolution. But at the same time, he concentrated a huge amount of power in his own hands. His reign brought both great achievements and immense challenges to France and Europe.
It's amazing how quickly things changed from a revolution for democracy to an empire ruled by one man.
Absolutely. Napoleon's rise to power marked a new chapter in French history. While he brought stability and reform, he also led France into a series of wars that would eventually lead to his downfall.
In our next episode, we'll dive into Napoleon's empire and the Napoleonic Wars, as well as his eventual fall from power.
This is getting really interesting. I'm excited to hear more about Napoleon's conquests and how it all ended.
We've got a lot more to cover, Chris. Thanks for joining us again.
See you next time when we talk about Napoleon's empire and the challenges he faced.
Looking forward to it. See you both next time. I've been thinking about Napoleon's rise to power. It's crazy how he became emperor after all that chaos. But what happened next? Did he just conquer Europe?
That's a great question, Chris. After he became Emperor of the French in 1804, Napoleon did indeed set out to conquer much of Europe. This period became known as the Napoleonic Wars, and it lasted until 1815.
Napoleon's military genius was a huge factor in his success. He won major battles like Austerlitz in 1805, which is often considered one of his greatest victories. He defeated the Austrian, Russian, and Prussian armies, establishing his dominance over much of Europe.
So he really was unbeatable for a while.
Yes, for a time it seemed like nothing could stop him. By 1810, Napoleon had built an empire that stretched from Spain in the west to Poland in the east. He installed his relatives as rulers of different European kingdoms, creating what was essentially a French empire.
But, as with all empires, Napoleon's had its limits. His expansionist ambitions eventually led him into conflict with Britain, Russia, and other major powers that would come back to haunt him.
What went wrong?
One of Napoleon's biggest mistakes was his invasion of Russia in 1812. He thought that by defeating Russia he could consolidate his control over Europe. But the Russian campaign was a disaster.
Napoleon's army marched into Russia with around 600,000 troops, but the Russians used scorched earth tactics, burning their own land and resources as they retreated. This left Napoleon's troops without food or supplies. Then, the brutal Russian winter set in.
That sounds like a nightmare. How did Napoleon's army survive?
They didn't, really. By the time Napoleon retreated from Russia, only a fraction of his army made it out alive. It was one of the worst military defeats in history. Napoleon's power began to crumble after that.
So, the invasion of Russia was the beginning of the end for him?
Exactly. After the disastrous Russian campaign, Napoleon's enemies saw an opportunity to strike. A coalition of European powers, including Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia, formed an alliance to defeat him.
In 1814, the coalition forces invaded France, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate. He was exiled to the island of Elba, but, as we know, that wasn't the end of his story.
Right. I've heard about his return from exile. What happened there?
In 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba and returned to France, where he was greeted as a hero by many. He quickly gathered an army and took control of France again during a period known as the 100 Days.
But his return was short-lived. The coalition forces, led by the Duke of Wellington, moved quickly to stop him. The decisive battle took place at Waterloo in June 1815.
And that's where Napoleon was finally defeated, right?
Yes, at the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon's forces were decisively defeated. After that, he was forced to abdicate again, and this time, the Allies didn't take any chances. He was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he lived out the rest of his life.
It's amazing how he went from conquering Europe to being exiled twice.
Napoleon's story is one of incredible highs and dramatic lows. He was a brilliant leader, but his ambitions ultimately led to his downfall. His legacy is complicated. On the one hand, he spread revolutionary ideas across Europe, but on the other, he caused immense suffering through his wars.
That's true. Even today, historians debate whether Napoleon was a hero or a tyrant. But there's no denying his impact on Europe and the world. His reforms, especially the Napoleonic Code, left a lasting legacy.
So, what happened to France after Napoleon's fall?
After Napoleon was exiled, the monarchy was restored in France, with King Louis XVIII, the brother of Louis XVI, taking the throne. But the country had changed forever after the Revolution and Napoleon's rule. France would continue to see political upheaval throughout the 19th century.
That's right. The Revolution's ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity continued to shape French society, but it would be a long and complicated road to stability.
Wow, I've learned so much about the French Revolution and Napoleon. Thanks for breaking it all down for me, Jesse and Emily.
You're welcome, Chris. It's been a fascinating journey through one of the most transformative periods in history.
We're glad you've enjoyed it. There's always more history to explore.
I can't wait for the next topic. Thanks again, and see you both next time.